We are right in the middle of week 2, but I'm bringing you my rest of season rankings. We are giving you my running back, wide receiver, tight end, and QB rest of season rankings. And starting it off with these running backs, we got this S tier and we got the elite level guys. We got Bijan, Brees, CMC, Saquon, Jahmyr Gibbs, Jonathan Taylor, and Devon Achane. And the thing that I want to highlight is at the top, it's really hard right now with the CMC injury to kind of project CMC, but assuming that he is going to be healthy at some point within the next 2 weeks, CMC has to remain here in the S tier. We've seen the Brees Hall, Bijan Robinson debates. I still have Bijan Robinson right now as my RB1 rest of the season. You might be able to debate me on that. Saquon Barkley, after that amazing week 1 game, absolutely has to be put up into this S tier. Jahmyr Gibbs, Jonathan Taylor, and then Devon Achane, who had a really great game in week 2. Absolutely have to love the start of these running back rankings. When we move into this A tier, we started off with Travis Etienne, who did have a little bit of snap share issues with Tank Bigsby in week 1, but I am not concerned about that heading into the rest of the season. Absolutely love Travis Etienne, leading it off as my RB8 in the A tier. Then we move on to Isaiah Pacheco, and we saw how elite, how prolific this Kansas City Chiefs offense can be. We knew it was going to be that way, so I am super excited and pumped for Isaiah Pacheco here in the rest of the season. Of course, have him in the A tier. Kyren Williams is the next guy. There's a few things that I want to see from Kyren Williams going forward. Like we said, the Sunday night game, only 12.9 fantasy points. He did have a 91% snap share, 18 attempts for 50 yards and 1 total touchdown with 3 receptions. So he was on the field. He just wasn't super productive. And I think the demise has been a bit premature to Kyren Williams, that a lot of people have thrown on him in the fantasy space. Have Kyren Williams here. Joe Mixon had a great first week in the Houston Texans as the absolute bell cow. Have him here. And then Derrick Henry, I think things are going to improve for Baltimore in week 2 and going forward. The offensive line is going to have to get itself under wraps. Otherwise, I think Derrick Henry would be a locked and loaded guy to get 16 to 20 touchdowns this year. And I still think there's that chance. That's why I have Derrick Henry here in the A tier. And we move over to the B tier. And honestly, we should maybe make the argument that James Cook should be pushed above, because I'm recording this during the halftime of the Thursday night game. And James Cook already has 3 total touchdowns. We'll have to see what he ends up with this game. Looks absolutely like the number 1 weapon. We talked about how Dalton Kincaid and James Cook are the most for sure things in this Buffalo Bills offense. Maybe could make the argument that it should just be James Cook as the weapons for Josh Allen. Kenneth Walker is the second guy. Kenneth Walker, we'll have to see if he goes in week 2. There's a chance that Zach Charbonnet is the starter, but Kenneth Walker was absolutely electric in his week 1 performance in this Ryan Grubb offense. We absolutely love to see it with 17.9 fantasy points, 66% snap share, 20 total attempts for 103 yards and 1 total touchdown. Absolutely love some Kenneth Walker here in the B tier. Alvin Kamara is the next guy in this tier, and we've talked about how it was the Alvin Kamara, it was the Chris Olave show. Rashid Shaheed looked really good in week 1, but he did have 19.5 fantasy points with a 52% snap share. So I don't think the snap share of Alvin Kamara, like we said, I'm not concerned because last year he only had a 50. At the end of the season, had 52 in week 1. So very much so continuing on that progressive track. I think Alvin Kamara here in the B tier could be a little low depending on how the rest of the season goes. Josh Jacobs, he's going to be playing in week 2 without Jordan Love, but I think volume wise for Josh Jacobs, he didn't look absolutely washed. I mean, we start to get worried with these running backs post their age 26 season, and he's right there on age 26. He did have 16 attempts for 84 yards, 5.3 yards per carry, so we like to see it. 73% snap share. I think there's brighter and better days ahead for Josh Jacobs. Then we got Rachaad White and Ramondre Stevenson to round out this tier. When we move on to the C tier starts off with James Conner. Absolutely love the volume. We'll have to see if Trey Benson starts to eat in more during the season. James Conner has looked absolutely efficient in his week 1 game. We'll have to see how he does in week 2 versus the Rams, but 17.8 fantasy points in week 1 has me excited for the rest of the season. We then have Aaron Jones, David Montgomery, Brian Robinson, who surprisingly looked super explosive, and the game script wasn't great, but he was able to actually get a ton of the early down work as well as some third down work over Austin Eckler. Have Brian Robinson here. Tony Pollard looked almost like 2 seasons ago. Tony Pollard in week 1. I know the Tennessee Titans gave him that big extension this offseason, and then rounding out the C tier with Najee Harris. We move on to the D tier, and it's going to be DeAndre Swift, Jerome Ford, J.K. Dobbins, Zamir White, Devin Singletary, and Zach Moss. The part is I am excited with J.K. Dobbins sitting here because we saw the absolute explosion. I know you're always worried about that coming off of Achilles injury, but he did look super great coming in that D tier. We move on to the E tier. We got Tajay, Raheem Mostert, Javonte Williams, Chase Brown, Zeke, Gus Edwards, and Chuba Hubbard. You're probably going to say to me, well, Caleb, where's Jordan Mason on this list? Like I said, guys, this is going to be my top 36 running backs, so there is going to be the case to be made that potentially I'm missing out on a few guys, but as we kind of got down, I went with how I'm projecting. We saw some stuff in week 1 and how I project things going forward. So that's my rest of the season rankings for my running backs, and let's move on to wide receivers. Starting it off with the wide receivers, we got the S tier. We got Tyreek Hill, CeeDee Lamb, Jamar Chase, Amon-Ra St. Brown, AJ Brown, Brown, Justin Jefferson, and Garrett Wilson. And honestly, this is kind of typically how you were drafting in the preseason. The only difference is no Puka Nacua based on that injury. I think you have to feel really good about this top 7. Like I said, there's probably maybe a small tier break between Tyreek Hill and CeeDee Lamb and the rest of the field currently right now. But after what we saw AJ Brown do in week 1, Amon-Ra St. Brown started off slow, so did Jamar Chase. I think they both end up picking up, and I like the rankings that I have just based on the rest of the season and what we saw in week 1. We move on to A tier and starting off with Cooper Kupp, who we know there's going to be no Puka Nacua for the next 4 to 5 weeks. So you maybe should make the argument, hey, Caleb, Puka Nacua should be over Garrett Wilson in the S tier. I hear that argument. Cooper Kupp looked absolutely electric. I'm a little bit worried about the age, but he is going to be getting the targets. He is going to be getting the snap share the next 2 weeks. So absolutely love that for Cooper Kupp. Mike Evans, dude's doing what he always does. Have him here in the A tier. Then we also have Jalen Waddle and then Rashee Rice. And maybe you should make the argument that Rashee Rice and Nico Collins and Debo should all be over Jalen Waddle. This is just my personal preference with how we're doing these tiers heading into the rest of the season and then rounding out this tier with Chris Olave. We'll move on to the B tier. We got Devontae Adams, Devontae Smith, Brandon Ayuk, Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, Drake London, and DJ Moore. The part that I want to hit on with this B tier is the fact that I still have these rookies in here. We saw a little bit of a disappointment from Malik Neighbors. We saw a huge disappointment from Marvin Harrison Jr., but I still both have these guys in the B tier. Brandon Ayuk, we need to see things start to progress. Like I said, last year was an amazing year for Brandon Ayuk. It hasn't been off to that same level start after week 1. Devontae Adams didn't have the best week 1, but I am still banking on the fact that he will do a lot better heading into the rest of the season, because if we look at Devontae Adams, he actually still had only 6 targets. So we wanted to see more targets out of him in week 1. I think he potentially gets that here over the coming weeks. We then move to our C tier and we got DK Metcalf, Stephon Diggs, Chris Godwin, Zay Flowers, George Pickens, Michael Pittman Jr., and Puka Nacua. I pushed Puka Nacua all the way down here because, like I said, we don't know when Puka Nacua is coming back. If you haven't already checked out my video from yesterday talking about like what are some offers if you have Puka Nacua, what that would look like, I just think of this tier. We got a bunch of guys with upside. We saw Stephon Diggs have the touchdown in week 1. Chris Godwin looked good. George Pickens had his moments. But then there's also like the guys like DK Metcalf and Michael Pittman Jr. that also kind of let you down. So once we're kind of in this tier, this is based on projections of offenses, but also kind of what we've seen from them before. So like I said, early on with these rest of season rankings, a lot of it is based on our projections and going forward, because we do know that some of the matchups in week 1 were not ideal and in the ideal circumstances for some of these wide receivers, especially with the lack of passing touchdowns. We look in the D tier, we got Jaden Reed, who absolutely broke out. He kind of broke out last year towards the end of the season, had a huge week 1. Amari Cooper, Xavier Worthy, Tank Dell, T. Higgins, Christian Kirk, and Terry McLaurin. A lot of these guys in the tiers, like Xavier Worthy, Jaden Reed, you feel great about him in week 1. A lot of guys like T. Higgins and Terry McLaurin and Amari Cooper, you didn't feel great about in week 1. A lot of this, again, we're saying is projection. So this is coming into the rest of these rankings. So if you think I have someone too high or too low, let me know down below. We move on to the E tier. We got Khalil Shakir, Calvin Ridley, Jamison Williams after that huge breakout game in week 1, Deontay Johnson, Brian Thomas Jr., Ladd McConkey, and Keenan Allen. Hopefully this Bears team can kind of start to turn around, because DJ Moore and Keenan Allen both feel relatively low compared to where we had them coming into the season. But I think it's hard to, after what we saw from this Bears overall offense and what we saw from Caleb, like even if it gets better, like he threw for 180 passing yards, like if he gets to 250, I still don't think that's going to be enough to support both DJ Moore and Keenan Allen consistently week by week. So that's why I have Keenan Allen in the E tier. Move on to the F tier. We got Jordan Addison, Keon Coleman, JSN, Tyler Lockett, DeAndre Hopkins, and Cortland Sutton. And I think having Calvin Ridley a little bit lower also pushes down DeAndre Hopkins, because I think DeAndre Hopkins is the 2, not only based on contract, but based on performance in this offense. JSN, maybe I should push JSN even lower. Like if we're here right now, I probably should push JSN behind Tyler Lockett after what we saw in week 2. I'm praying for a JSN breakout, but as we continue on, I just think we get farther and farther away. And then we ended off with the G tier with Josh Palmer, Curtis Samuel, Demarcus Robinson, A.D. Mitchell, Brandon Cooks, Jacoby Myers, and Hollywood Brown. When we move on to quarterbacks rest of the season, we started off in this big S tier, and I hope you got one of these elite level quarterbacks in your draft. You got Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson, Anthony Richardson, CJ Stroud, Kyler Murray. Got to feel good about each and every one of those guys. Not all of them performed up to par in week 1, but I do think the Konami code rushing code upside, almost all of them, is absolutely incredible. And even like maybe the worst scrambler here is CJ Stroud. He's playing with 3 legit level weapons in his offense. So absolutely love the S tier. We move on to the A tier. We got Joe Burrow, Jaden Daniels, Dak Prescott, Tua, Brock Purdy, Jared Goff, Trevor Lawrence. Jaden Daniels honestly made the biggest push up because he didn't look like the best real life NFL quarterback. It might not translate to wins, but it's going to translate to a bunch of rushing yards. Joe Burrow needs to get back on track. I know a lot of people were selecting Joe Burrow over Kyler Murray. That was not me this offseason. So I do have Joe Burrow leading off the A tier. Move on to the B tier, and this is where Caleb Williams does come into play. A lot of that projection as a rookie level quarterback quarterback. It was week 1. So going forward, I think there's a lot to be excited about with the options and coaching staff that he does have. Jordan Love with that injury gets pushed down my rest of season rankings because we need to see him come back and be able to be mobile on that leg. Because if he's not, he's going to be a sitting duck back there. I think that's going to hurt him because he's not like the most athletic guy, but he's athletic enough to kind of avoid pressure. We got Justin Fields as the next guy, and I think Justin Fields just continues to run away with this job for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Hope you drafted some Justin Fields because he will be a top 12 quarterback for you on a week-by-week basis. Justin Herbert's next. We just wish there was more passing volume in this offense. Matt Stafford, Baker Mayfield, Aaron Rodgers round out the B tier, and then there's just a bunch of bench guys. So if you really want to debate who my tiers are on the bench, feel free, but I think those elite level options for you should be enough. When we move over to our tight ends disappointed us in week 1. So going into week 2 in our rest of season rankings, we're banking on these guys starting to kind of turn things around. We start off in that tier. We still have Travis Kelce as our tight end 1. That hasn't changed. Offense super efficient. Travis Kelce, I know it feels like he kind of takes the regular season off, but it was just week 1. Let's not forget that Travis Kelce had an awful week 1 last year as well. Excited to see what he can do going forward. Sam Laporta had himself a pretty good day in week 1. It could have been better, but it wasn't as bad as our boy Amon-Ra St. Brown. Only had 6.5 fantasy points. I think this whole offense does better. It was a really heavy run attack. I think these pass catching options get a little bit more done in week 2, 3, 4 going on. Trey McBride pretty much showed that he was the number 1 receiving option for the Arizona Cardinals. A lot of people love some Trey McBride, but he only put up 5.5 fantasy points. Like we said, it was not the week of the tight ends last week. And then Dalton Kincaid, I think, is the clear best pass catching option for Josh Allen in this offense. Have him here in the S tier. And then we start off the A tier, and I already hear the comments coming in. Caleb, why the heck do you have Mark Andrews so high? And the reason I have Mark Andrews so high is not only because of the snap share. He did only have 2.4 fantasy points, 74% snap share, 2 total targets. I just think there was a lot going against Mark Andrews in week 1, and so I'm going to re-roll the dice with Mark Andrews. Now, if you do see in this tier, I do have Isaiah Likely still right here. So I'm not over here telling you, hey, don't, Mark Andrews is 100% going to be a hit. Like, there's an argument that we should have Mark Andrews lower down our rankings. I'm just projecting him. I'm still expecting big things from Mark Andrews this year. I drafted him on a whole lot of teams, so maybe this is me just being sentimental. I do have Mark Andrews here, Kyle Pitts, Isaiah Likely, George Kittle, Evan Ingram, rounding out the A tier for tight ends. But then we move to the B tier. We got Brock Bowers, Dallas Goedert, Dalton Schultz, Pat Freiermuth, Hunter Henry, and that kind of put all the injured tight ends with David Njoku, TJ Hawkinson, Jake Ferguson. They're all going to be coming back at different times. It's really hard for me to kind of rank these guys. Like, honestly, if I could trade Hunter Henry for one of those guys, sure, I would do it. But just kind of rest of season rankings, hard for me to see how I'm evaluating these guys, but you got to be putting these guys into consideration. If you haven't already, hit that like and subscribe button, providing the best fantasy football content so you can win your fantasy football league in 2024. Like I said, guys, I appreciate you guys all for tuning in, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.